Live NFL trivia every Wednesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge for a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. December 21st, 2020. We're down at Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, on the beautiful teal field of Coastal Carolina University. And we've got a battle between the Appalachian State Mountaineers out of the Sun Belt and the North Texas Mean Green out of Conference USA. The Mountaineers won this game by a final score of 56-28, absolutely dominating en route to a successful but bizarre COVID-filled season. But for the purposes of this video, this game is important for one thing in particular, and it's not the fact that this was the first bowl game of the year. It's important because this was the first time ever that an NCAA bowl game was held in the state of South Carolina. Seems bizarre, right? It took until 2020 for a bowl game to be played in the Palmetto State. Considering how big football is in the South, and considering the fact that the weather is tolerable, it's crazy that it took until 2020 for South Carolina to have a bowl game. New Jersey got a bowl, New York got a bowl, and Washington got a bowl all before South Carolina did. But while 2020 was the first time that a bowl game was held in the Palmetto State, what you might not know is that there was supposed to be a bowl game played there more than 4 decades before. Because the Myrtle Beach Bowl was roughly 40 years in the making. Roughly 100 miles south of Myrtle Beach and Conway lies the city of Charleston, South Carolina. And in the early 1980s, it seemed like they were going to get a bowl of their own, helping out the Southern Conference and helping out the state's economy in the process. And then, everything fell apart for what felt like a pretty dumb reason, all things considered. Because this is the story behind the Charleston Bowl, otherwise known as South Carolina's forgotten, failed, and unsuccessful attempt to get a bowl game. Before I talk about the creation of said bowl game and why it failed, we need some context to understand the purpose behind this bowl game in the first place. Because a fairly common question, and one that I'm sure a lot of college football fans every time a new bowl game gets added, probably came to your mind. Do we really need another bowl game? Even back in 1979, when this idea was first proposed, it felt like there was an influx of not-so-good teams starting to go bowling, and you had 2 new bowls on the horizon in the California Bowl and the Pineapple Bowl, which was renamed to the Aloha Bowl before ever playing its first game. I mean, in 1979, Cal went to a bowl game against Temple in the Garden State Bowl, even though they were 6-5, and had lost 5 of their last 8 games beforehand. So why another bowl game, especially if not all these bowls were even televised across the country? Well, that's because the games that you've been watching this whole time, and will continue to watch throughout this video, come from a conference called the Southern Conference, or the SoCon. And in 1979, the SoCon consisted of 8 teams, all based relatively close to each other in the eastern part of the United States, mainly across the Carolinas and Tennessee. You had Appalachian State, Chattanooga, East Tennessee State, Furman, Marshall, the Citadel, VMI, and Western Carolina. And as a side note, if you want to learn more about the bizarre history of VMI football, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Back in 1979, the SoCon was still considered a Division 1A conference, as even though they were definitely on the smaller side of things, they were in the same division as your schools in the Big Ten and the SEC. And honestly, there were some pretty good teams in the SoCon, as it was a conference that throughout the 70s had shown that it could hold its own at the top. In 1976, for example, all 8 schools in the conference finished at or above 500, with East Carolina, who was a member at the time, going 9-2, with a win against NC State in the ACC, and even being ranked inside the AP top 20 at one point. Richmond was another one of those schools in 1973, when they were ranked inside the top 20, and not only beat Wake Forest out of the ACC, but shut them out by a final score of 41-0. However, there was one problem that the SoCon constantly found themselves dealing with, and that was the fact that year after year, they were snubbed from bowl games. There were very few bowl games back in the 1970s that were independently tied, meaning that they didn't have to abide by the order of a conference, and could take anyone. bowl games had conference affiliations, and if they did have the option to take a wild card and take any team in the country, you can bet that they weren't going to take a team from the SoCon. Not when you have to worry about attendance figures, seeing as your bowl game gets decertified if you don't reach certain attendance benchmarks. Not when you have to worry about television stations breathing down your throat wanting the game to get good ratings, and not when you have schools that, when compared to schools in bigger conferences, have smaller fan bases. The last time a SoCon team even made it to a bowl game was when they had that conference tie-in back at the 1971 Tangerine Bowl. Now, we had been roughly a decade from the last time that the SoCon played in a bowl game, so the conference makeup was a bit different. And obviously, the players on the team were different. But fair or not, the last 3 times the SoCon played in a bowl game, when they got the auto bid to the Tangerine Bowl, they got absolutely destroyed, with Davidson losing 56-33 to Toledo in 1969, William & Mary, with a losing record, losing 40-12 to Toledo in 1970, and Richmond losing 28-3 to Toledo in 1971. Holy Toledo! That's a lot of blowout games, as that's a point differential that the SoCon was outscored by in their last 3 bowl appearances of minus 76. So as much as it stinks, you can at least understand, even if they had the option to, why bowls were skeptical of inviting SoCon teams to play. And this hurt in a lot of ways. It hurt from a recruiting standpoint, because part of the draw to coming to a school to play college football is for the opportunity to go bowling and play in a postseason game. Whereas kids dream of playing for schools in the Big Ten and the Pac-10 to play in the Rose Bowl, these SoCon schools didn't really have that. It hurt from an exposure standpoint, because bowl games provided an opportunity to be seen on television in parts of the country that otherwise wouldn't get your games, and they didn't have that. And it especially hurt from a financial standpoint, because playing in a bowl game means that the team that plays and the conference that participates in it gets money. The SoCon was one of just 3 conferences in Division 1A that did not have an automatic bid to a bowl game, with the Missouri Valley Conference being one and the Ivy League being the other, although the Ivy League willingly opts out of playing postseason football for academic reasons. And that's when Bill Ackerman, a Charleston businessman, had an idea. Ackerman was big in the Charleston area, and loved doing everything and anything that he could to give back to the community. As Ackerman once said, "Whatever it takes to better people's way of life, I want to be a part of." And not only was Ackerman very rich, but he was a huge sports fan. He was the owner of a AA baseball team in the 1960s that was affiliated with the Chicago White Sox. He was responsible for bringing NFL preseason games to Charleston, including games involving the Baltimore Colts and the Chicago Bears. And he played football all throughout college, so he was obviously very familiar with the game. Which is why in 1979, he created a private group known as the Charleston Bowl Association, with the idea being to not only bring a bowl game to Charleston, where they would play at the home stadium of the Citadel, which holds 22,500 people, but to have the champion of the Southern Conference finally have a postseason game of their own. It was a win for everyone. The SoCon gets a bowl, South Carolina finally gets a bowl game in their state, and everyone is happy. Even though this was a private group that put this together, the Southern Conference gave Ackerman their full support, and fully endorsed the project. As Ken German, the commissioner of the SoCon, said on this bowl, "We will be actively involved in the bowl's operation with representation on the selection committee and other aspects." And in the spring of 1980, the SoCon officially voted to affiliate with the bowl game. Now there was just one thing left to do. Wait a year for the NCAA Special Events Committee to meet, and hope that they give it the green light. So you'd think that this would be a slam dunk, right? Finances are not an issue. The bowl game has a conference champion playing relatively close to home, or quite literally at home if the Citadel ever made it, and it allows for a conference to finally be represented in the playoff picture. Should be relatively straightforward. Except, it wasn't. Because even though the bowl games seemed fine, the NCAA said that there was a problem that needed to be addressed, and that was the fact that it was not a closed bowl concept. What does a closed bowl concept mean? It means that the 2 teams are guaranteed, no matter what, to play there. In other words, no at-larges. it had to be the champion of the SoCon against a predetermined opponent, like the number 4 team in the SEC, or the number 3 team in the Big Ten, or something like that. You couldn't go out and get an independent. If you can find a conference who wants to play in this game with you, then we'll give it to you. But if not, you're not getting approved. Now on the surface, this seems absolutely insane, especially since last time I checked, they approved the Aloha Bowl, and that had no conference affiliations at all. In 1982, it was a game between the Pac-10 and the ACC. In 1983, it was the Pac-10 against an independent. In 1984, it was an independent against the Southwest Conference. In 1985, it was the SEC against the Pac-10. And in 1986, it was the SEC against the ACC. Over the first 5 years of the game's existence, there were 5 different conference pairings, and it wasn't until 1987 with a game between UCLA and Florida that we actually had a repeat pairing of 2 conferences. They could pick whoever they wanted to, and yet, the Charleston Bowl couldn't? For what it's worth, I could not find any reason for this hypocrisy, and why the NCAA had no problem with one bowl game, but had a massive problem with the other, even though they filed their applications for approval in the same exact year. However, the SoCon now had a goal to get this game, now known as the Patriots Bowl, to be played. Find an opponent. Their first idea was to look at the Missouri Valley Conference champion and see if they wanted to play, since that conference was the only other conference that unwillingly did not have a postseason tie-in. However, while this seemed to make sense on paper, in practicality, it was a bit more complicated than that. The Missouri Valley Conference had 7 schools at the time, with none of them being particularly close to Charleston. You had Drake, Indiana State, New Mexico State, Southern Illinois, Tulsa, West Texas A&M, and Wichita State. The closest school is Indiana State, which is 800 miles away. The furthest school is New Mexico State, which is nearly 1,800 miles away. Good luck getting schools to come bring fan support from that far away, and to have it make financial sense for those schools to play in the game and travel all that way, especially in cases like New Mexico State, where they're literally going across the country. Which brings us the last-ditch option that the SoCon had. This was their last chance to find an opponent, and that was to take the next best team in the ACC, which was usually the 3rd place team or the 4th place team. You get a big school, you get a school with local ties that has a fan base around the Charleston area, and you pretty much guarantee a sellout and secure the stability and success of this bowl game. Except that the ACC was not on board with that. It wasn't because the ACC had anything against the SoCon, and it's not that they felt this game was beneath them, but rather, they feared that the next team up in the standings would have a losing record, as even though there were no rules against it, they didn't want a team with a losing record or 5 wins or less to play in a bowl, since it would be a bad look for the conference, and since it hadn't happened in college football that a non-conference champion played in a bowl with a losing record since SMU in 1963 in the Sun Bowl. As a side note, to learn more about teams with losing records in bowl games, click the card in the upper right corner. Which raises the question, was that fear warranted? Well, if they were worried about having a team with a losing record play in this game, it was actually 100% warranted to decline the invite to the Charleston Bowl. Sure, in 1979 and 1980, this would not have been a problem. NC State would have gotten the invite in 1980 with a 6-5 record, and NC State would have gotten the invite in 1979 with a 7-4 record. Although if they declined, as they declined the invite to the Garden State Bowl, they could have given it to Maryland or Virginia, both teams with winning records. But from 1972 to 78, with the exception of 1974, when Clemson would have been invited with a 7-4 record, every single invite to the Charleston Bowl would have been a team with 5 wins or less that would have been at or below 500, including a 1975 Duke team that won just 4 games. Typically, back in the early 80s, the ACC teams that had winning records got invited to bowls, and they weren't snubbed from anything, so it was teams with losing records who were being left out. And this meant that with no second team in tie-in, unable to get the Missouri Valley or the ACC on board, the game was scrapped. There was no more Charleston Bowl. There was no more Patriots Bowl. And there would never be another SoCon team to ever make it to a bowl game, as they got reclassified to Division I AA in 1982. With this decision, quite possibly, being the straw that broke the camel's back. Today, we finally have a bowl game in South Carolina. And today, mid-major schools rightfully get to send not just their conference champion to a bowl game, but just about every eligible team to one. But back in the early 80s, that was not the case. Because if it was, then the SoCon not only would have sent its champion bowling, but Charleston would have had a postseason game of their own. Because even though things were looking up in the Southern Conference, thanks to the NCAA's bizarre decision and the refusal of other conferences to cooperate for one reason or another, everything ended up going south. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.